Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is going to be our final installment in our 1970s U.S. history video lecture series. This one is going to focus almost entirely. We're bringing it back to domestic history, the Jimmy Carter years, with a rather large emphasis on popular culture in the 1970s. This is a rather long one, 31 slides. So I'm going to try to keep it under an hour as much as I can. I should also tell you, this one is going to be a lot of anecdotal information since, I actually lived during this period. However, the perspective of a very young child. So, how accurate of a historical representation that is, I don't know what to tell you. It is from the perspective of a very young child. So when we get to that part, I'll let you know. So on with the 1970s Jimmy Carter years. And as you can see, absolutely right. Jimmy Carter, we haven't had a Democrat in the White House since Lyndon B. Johnson, and he kind of left on a unpopular note. And so here we have first Democrat in a long time. His election very much was the result of, damage done to the Republican brand by Nixon and later on Ford. And he's elected into office with a Democratic Congress. And yeah, absolutely. It is very much a reaction to that. He's going to be there for one term. And we discussed, a lot of the things that perhaps contributed to this. The year that he actually enters the presidency, well, it wouldn't be. It would be it was Bicentennial Year. Yeah, his first year in the White House was a year of bicentennial. I remember it was a big deal. They started, for anybody that cares, I was in first grade. But other than that, yes, bicentennial, big deal. They made a big deal out of it, a big celebration. And they made the back of the 25 cents coins celebratory of the 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So, let's start here. Energy continued to be a big concern. Energy continued to be a big concern for the country. Yes, the oil crisis of 73 had come and gone. Still not, still weren't back to normal. Okay, fuel prices were still high. Summer of 77 and 76 and 77. I'm sorry, not the summer, the winter, particularly cold winter, and we were dealing in this case with a natural gas shortage. Jimmy Carter decides to be the president that's going to tackle the problem of energy heads on. And on April 18th, 1977, he gives his famous fireside chat on energy, or what he calls, he equated the energy crisis with the moral equivalent of war, and that Americans should mobilize for this crisis just as they mobilize in times of war. President Carter called for an increased use of coal, the use of the U.S. coal stockpile, careful expansion of nuclear power, all of this with the interest of weaning us off foreign oil. And the one that really got, and this was the sign, he's trying to invoke FDR, a fireside chat, and he's wearing a sweater in the White House, very Mr. Rogers. And there was a subtle message in him wearing this sweater. He's asking Americans to conserve energy. The way we're going to beat this energy crisis is if we teach ourselves to simply stop using energy so wastefully, start conservating energy. He's urging Americans to do the same thing that he's going to do in the White House. He's going to set the thermostat at no higher than 65 degrees in the winter. And that's a picture of an old thermostat. In this act in itself It's part of a broader effort from the federal government and the Carter administration to address energy conservation. In 1977, Jimmy Carter creates the Department of Energy, a federal agency um, whose purpose is to regulate and oversee our energy industry and energy resources. A big promotional campaign is unleashed by the federal government to get Americans to, yeah, to cut down on energy consumption. So you can see, turn off the lights, turn down the thermostat. Um, when it's cold, turn it up, within limits, et cetera, et cetera. I remember there was also a big push to go after litter bugs. Apparently, litter. I mean, this is not the same as when you grew, the America you live in today. People drove without seatbelts, and people would just throw garbage out of their windows. The reason why that people just fines for doing that is because, it's in the 70s that the authorities started cracking down. People just literally throwing garbage out the window. And so, but that's another story altogether. So speaking of environmentalism, which, the word was, but that's pretty much a good portion of President Carter's focus of his presidency was on that. We have, up to that point, the most significant environmental disaster in this country's history, Love Canal, which happened in Niagara Falls, New York. And they didn't even know. I mean, this is a big deal, but if only they had a crystal ball and were able to see how widespread this problem was throughout the country. So in the 1950s, there's a dump that is purchased by a particular company. They use it to dump toxic waste. They sell the site. Um, Everybody forgets what it was built for. A neighborhood goes up nearby. And one particular winter, the winter of 77, there's a significant snowfall, very cold winter. And as spring sets in, the snow starts to melt. And the water, as it goes through the soil, encounters these toxins that had long been buried, and it bleaches into the water table. And before you know it, you got people reporting significant health concerns, very high white blood cell counts, and even cases of leukemia. And the federal government came in and validated the information that there were clusters, the way they call it. And they linked it all the way back to the prior use of a nearby location as a toxic dump. And those toxins, thanks to the snow, bleached into the water table. This was a wake-up call to the authorities that, listen, we just can't, and even till today this is true, we just can't, industrial byproducts that are dangerous to human beings and the environment. You know, we have a long-term responsibility to make sure that we dispose of these things carefully. Quite often nearby communities, and this still happens till today, fracking in Flint, Michigan, with the lead in the water. Um, Love Canal does become the first federal Superfund site, meaning that a significant amount of dollars through the Environmental Protection Agency are diverted towards that particular location to seriously clean up. And I'm talking about like removing layers of topsoil, putting them in drums, burying these drums deep underground, etc., etc. And let's add even greater calamity, potential environmental issue. Since the 1950s, I believe, we have been opening as an alternative, and this was seen for a time as a viable alternative to fossil fuels, nuclear power plants. Okay, the use of radioactive material to quickly heat water to turn the steam, so it turns a steam turbine and creates energy. It's very simple. We have one nearby south of Homestead called Turkey Point, and it produces energy, and it's the emissions are non-pollutant. They don't contribute to climate change, etc., but incredibly dangerous. 3 Mile Island, March 1979. The United States almost had a a horrific nuclear catastrophe. Almost. Okay. I'm not going to pretend to be a nuclear physicist or an engineer or know anything of that nature. I do know that in reactor number 2, there was a coolant leak, which led to a partial meltdown of the fuel rods, themselves being radioactive material. It released radiation in the form of gas into the nearby area. I believe years later, when they came back, they estimated that everybody within the 10-mile radius received the equivalent of like at least one chest x-ray of radiation. 3 Mile Island is important because it woke up the nuclear power industry, and that they have to take greater measures to secure the safety of their plants. A catastrophe would be a very serious catastrophe. Had we had more than just a partial meltdown. But this also energized the anti-nuclear power activist who believed that whatever, and you know, they're still still out there. I mean, they succeeded. I mean, we haven't had a nuclear power plant built in this country, if I'm not mistaken, since maybe the late 70s. They're all old plants. Um, the argument was the potential catastrophic danger of something going wrong in a nuclear power plant outweighs the benefits, the cleaner energy benefits of a power plant. So that was 3 Mile Island. On the social angle, we have the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment, that ball started rolling, oh, I'm going to say in the late 60s. The idea behind the Equal Rights Amendment was to introduce an amendment that would, by constitution, declare no legal distinction between men and women. Therefore, recognize the legal equality of men and women. And this would address issues such as pay inequality, employment opportunity inequality, education inequality, etc., etc. So the idea was to end legal distinctions between men and women, with particular emphasis also in cases of divorce, property rights, employment, and other matters. 1971, by a majority, the House voted yes. 1972, the Senate voted yes, and you need like a two-thirds majority. They passed a resolution giving it a deadline of March 22nd, 1979 to get the 3/5 ratification of all the states in the Union. And Gloria Steinem of National Organization of Women was very much behind the drive for the Equal Rights Amendment. But wouldn't you know, they had opposition in the form of Phyllis Schlafly, or Schlafly, conservative woman, um, very involved in Republican politics, organized a very effective uh, movement to oppose the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, you would expect a man. Oh, no, it was a woman. In her opinion, if the ERA would pass, it would disadvantage housewives. It would cause women to be drafted into the army in times of war. It would remove many of the legal protections that women have enjoyed for years, particularly in cases of alimony and the custody of children, which traditionally family courts have always granted women the children in cases of divorce. It also it would also eliminate, she claimed, specific gender-based protections for women in the workplace. I mean, the way she thought, I mean, you could just read that quote there. Newsflash, one reason a woman gets married is to be supported by her husband while caring for her children at home. So long as her husband earns a good income, she doesn't care about the pay gap between them. And remember, she's pretty much a conservative ideologue. She sees equal rights before men and women as a Pandora's box that's going to lead to other things. For example, she opposed feminism wholeheartedly. She opposed abortion. Um, she opposed the concept of marital rape. She believed that once you were married, rape was impossible. She opposed same-sex marriage, okay, which she believed that the ERA would open the door to. If you make no distinction by law of gender, then, and also she did not agree with immigration reform. She had some nasty things to say about that. Well, agree with her or not, her campaign was quite effective. In fact, well, it's in the last slide. They needed 38 states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, um, so that it could become part of the Constitution to meet the three-fifths requirement. By the deadline, only 35 had done so. Number 35 was Florida. And the campaign that she launched in Florida to keep, only one of our houses of the legislature passed it, to keep the Florida legislature from ratifying the ERA is what stopped the ERA in its tracks, and they did not meet the deadline. And even though the deadline was extended later on, a couple of states actually rescinded their approval. And to this day, the Equal Rights Amendment was an attempt, was an effort, but did not successfully make it onto the Constitution, in part due to the efforts of conservative women like Phyllis Schlafly. I believe Netflix has a series on her called Miss America that's rather recent. So here you go, the map. I thought I already passed the map. I didn't. Only 35 of the 38 states needed ratified this amendment, and it's in Florida. It's where it stops. And if you pick up on a pattern, folks, the most socially conservative states in the Union, oh, I don't know, the South, those tended to be the ones that opposed the Equal Rights Movement, Equal Rights Amendment, and Arizona, okay, which is the home of Barry Goldwater, and Utah, which of course, you know, the Mormons have a significant presence there. 1979, and we get another oil-related energy crisis. This time it was not an embargo by OPEC. This time it was the Iranian Revolution. Iranian Revolution created a significant cut in oil production. I believe the barrel of oil tripled in a very short period of time. And it was actually more perception than anything else. Is a different cause, but now once again, lines in the gas station. This is 1979, if I'm not mistaken, like a gallon of gas was going for like $4. Okay. The federal government is actually contemplating rationing gas at this point. Jimmy Carter um, has his responses to this energy crisis, which is being caused by the Iranian revolution and they're not being able to participate in the oil industry like they had before, and creating a situation of scarcity. Jimmy Carter's responses goes right back to, we could get out of this situation if we simply learn to wean our dependence on foreign oil, conserve energy, and explore other types of energy. These are talking points that are very common today among the American left. And he's making them in the 1970s. Jimmy Carter installed the first solar panel water heaters on the White House. Okay, there he is taking a picture in front of reporters, showing off these new solar panels. By the way, his successor, Ronald Reagan, one of the first things his successor would do, and it was ideological, was rip out the solar panels because Ronald Reagan did not believe in energy conservation. Um, to add to this, Jimmy Carter orders public buildings to set their thermostats at, I believe, no warmer than 68 degrees in the winter and no cooler, I believe, than my numbers could be off, than 78 degrees in the summer. And for us to simply that almost minute difference in degree would actually save the country hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil a day. Um, did the majority of the American people go along with this? Mixed, mixed. And some say the nail in the coffin of Jimmy Carter's presidency is when he takes to the television. This time he's not in a cardigan sweater. This time he's in a suit. And he addresses, I'm going to put a link of this so you could watch it. Everybody should watch it. He addresses the issue of the energy crisis and what we as a country should be doing. We should be, in this together. And he doesn't see that. So, and a lot of people interpret the speech as one that the president is lecturing the American people. And so, well, of course he lost. The American people don't want to be lectured. They don't want to be told, what to do. Okay, they want to be told that you could do anything. They want to be, cheered along, not reprimanded. And a lot of people feel that this was a big mistake. This was Carter inaccurately reading what the American people would be willing to accept from a president. This is a short quote from there. The threat is nearly invisible in ordinary ways. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our lives and the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. So he goes in complete soapbox mode. And yeah, it's going to hurt more than it's going to help. And it's a shame because he did have some very real, if not uncomfortable truths to say, but it did hurt his presidency. All right, let's move along. Good. Now we're going to get to the part of 70s popular culture, which almost entirely is, what we're really asking is, we had a conversation about 60s popular culture. How did we go from there to 70s popular culture, and how did history play a role in shaping this? Okay, so these are some of the things on top of my head. Again, I'm as a child, television experienced a golden age in the 1970s. The quality of programming got better. The number of channels expanded, not greatly so. I mean, TV was still dominated by the networks, the ABC, CBS's, ABCs. That's about it. And yet, magically, mysteriously, there was always something of high quality to watch on TV. So whether it was the Jackson Five, a very popular, pop group at the time, that also dabbled in TV and TV specials. Um, Charlie's Angels, $6 Million Man. So this was your primetime TV. Children's programming, particularly PBS. Remember, PBS was created in the 1960s as the Center for Public Broadcasting. Here comes a man named Jim Henson, a puppeteer. And Jim Henson had shown up on shows like The Ed Sullivan Show with Rolf the Dog and Kermit the Frog. But he uses his Muppets, he calls them. And by going on PBS, he creates a show that is a cultural phenomenon. A show that is dedicated to teaching children the basics of reading, of letters, and of numbers in a very entertaining way. And it's sad that this show ran from 1970 all the way to just a couple of years ago, where PBS no longer was able to carry it, and it went over to HBO, and then it died. And of course, Disney bought the rights to the Muppets. But millions of children learned the basics of reading and numbers and letters through Sesame Street. It ran for, Jesus, 30, almost 40 years. A very similar show was The Electric Company. It was aimed towards slightly older children. Um, the thing about The Electric Company, a lot of people don't know, two individuals that are going to be pretty A-list celebrities later on. One of them is, listen, at the time, he was a well-loved figure, Bill Cosby, and Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman. And in that top picture there, it's not any TV show. It is a cultural phenomenon. Roller skating rinks became a thing in the 1970s, a cultural thing. Music of the 70s. Okay. Um, yeah, I put a picture up there of Dr. Frankenfurter from the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Okay, yeah, well, it wasn't a group in the 1970s, but he was, well, that character was part of a musical that was part of a growing trend in the 1970s, the rock opera, whether it was Rocky Horror Picture Show or Tommy that was put together by The Who. Um, so yes, the musical set to rock music, even Broadway musicals like Jesus Christ Superstar, for example, dabbled in the use of rock music as the musical genre for the musicals of the 1970s, therefore the rock opera, which is a great springboard to the group Kiss. That was a spectacle. Okay, they took from kabuki theater and they painted their faces. I mean, show business. I mean, if you got to make your way stand out, you got to make yourself stand out. And Kiss stood out with their outrageous costumes and their face painting and their platform shoes. I mean, were they, were they four of the greatest, songwriters, musicians around? No, they weren't. But they were showmen. They knew how to stand out in a crowd. Unlike the group underneath them that didn't need to paint their faces because of the incredibly gifted voice of Freddie Mercury, the group Queen. And we're kind of skipping here, and I'm not going to pretend to be a rock historian. And a lot of these groups are British, and in Britain you have this period in the early 70s referred to as glam rock. Um, and many characteristics of gender fluidity are adopted by many of the artists just to stand out from other genres. And Queen is going to be one of them. Um, in the middle, you have, that psychedelic rock of the 60s is going to turn towards heavy metal. But you know what? Whatever you think about, you can't see them from their hair, but that's Jimmy Page and Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin. And if you think that Led Zeppelin is a rock band or a heavy metal band or a psychedelic rock band, I mean, you're wrong in all of those. The trick that Led Zeppelin pulled, and nobody but the most astute ear picked up on it, was that Led Zeppelin was a blues band, inspired by blues artists, and most of the songs that they had success with were actually reboot reimaginings, covers of blues songs. They did a ton of covers and people didn't even notice it. And then, of course, the great David Bowie. He is the first artist that really was able to successfully recreate himself over and over again and stay relevant throughout the decades. And that's just one of his personas, and not even this earliest one. Just as there's a white musical experience, there's a black musical experience in American music. There's still a degree of musical segregation, but the gap is starting to close. The gap is starting to close. Probably the one show that was most responsible as a vehicle of introducing what they called in the 70s soul music. Even the Billboard company would have its own soul charts, which was music primarily and not necessarily only by, because there were white soul acts. Um, there was different variants of soul. Okay, your Philadelphia soul, um, Soul Train, which was a syndicated show that would bring uh, acts that were very popular among the African American community and the latest dances. From that community, you can have artists like Michael Jackson as a solo artist, the Commodores that had success not just in the soul charts, but in mainstream pop music charts as well. So black music, little by little, not yet, but little by little, a fusion is happening. It's going to take a couple more decades to work itself out. But little by little, this fusion that started in the 1920s, it's ongoing. I guess more icons of the 1970s. Back to TV shows, you had Welcome Back Carter. The sitcom was very popular in the 1970s. In that picture you see there, probably the one actor that's going to go on to great fame and fortune is John Travolta, who played Vinnie Barbarino on that show. Black exploitation, a particular genre of movies, usually low budget, came out in the 1970s. Um, Usually predominantly black cast. Uh, but here's the unfortunate. It was, whereas on the surface, it says, oh wow, we're starting to see more black people in movies and in music and in popular culture. But beneath the surface, you could argue that it was a new version of minstrel because the African Americans in this new genre that emerged, Superfly being one of them, were cast in stereotypical roles, playing stereotypical parts. You know, the pimp and the prostitute, the drug dealer. The roles that did not do much to uplift or challenge stereotypes, but actually reinforced them. That's why they were called black exploitation. The genre was referred to as black exploitation. Schoolhouse Rock, animated series that did pretty well and a pretty good job at teaching kids the basics of math and English and how government works. I Am a Bill. And it's still effective till today. And then, of course, Bruce Lee, cultural icon in the late 60s and early 70s. Because of Bruce Lee achieving fame and fortune in the United States, there was a boom, if you will, in interest in martial arts. Um, those buildings to the side, we're going to talk about them later, but yes, they were built in the 1970s. Not just TV, but Hollywood also experienced a golden age. All of these films, epic, memorable, landmark, films about the 1970s. And here's the thing. In so many of these films, New York City of the 1970s is the backdrop. Whether it's The French Connection with Gene Hackman, The Godfather, another epic, iconic 1970s film, Jaws, The Exorcist, Taxi Driver, if you really want to get an aesthetic feel for what the 1970s looked like, you have to watch one of Robert De Niro's earlier films, Taxi Driver. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, based on a true story. Jack Nicholson starred in it. Clockwork Orange, it was sci-fi. It was Anthony Burgess's novel of the same name, Clockwork Orange. Woody Allen peaked in his career with Annie Hall, which I believe won an Oscar. Of course, Star Wars, which blew everybody's minds in 1977. Of course, keep in mind the special effects of Star Wars would not have been possible without Stanley Kubrick's 2001 in the 1960s. Rocky, Sylvester Stallone's. Don't mistake the character for the individual. He's rather smart and educated. He went to University of Miami. He wrote that screenplay. He was down to his last $40 trying to sell that screenplay. If you ever watch that movie, you're going to see a dog in that film. Apparently, he sold that dog for money to eat. And then soon after that, he found the producer that was willing to take the script and let him star as the character Rocky Balboa, and he used that money to buy back his dog. All the President's Men, which you saw, Carrie, which was the first of Stephen King's novels made into a film adaptation, also starring John Travolta, Deliverance with Burt Reynolds, American Graffiti, which was actually George Lucas's first film before Star Wars. You can't talk about the 1970s, particularly musical aspects of the 1970s, about talking about Saturday Night Fever, Clint Eastwood, Tough Guy and Dirty Harry, Willy Wonka, the best Willy Wonka ever made, starring Gene Wilder, and then of course Mel Brooks in a comedy that no studio I think would pick up today, Blazing Saddles, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Hollywood and TV both experienced, especially horror films, experienced a golden period during the 1970s. Onward to lighter topics, fashion and just overall design. The leisure suit, the lava lamp, platform shoes, bell bottoms, hot pants, which I will not put on this slide, but you could look it up if you wish. 1970s furniture. For some reason, everybody was into fondue in the 1970s, which is basically dipping your food in melted cheese. It's apparently a big thing in Sweden or Switzerland, one of the two. Um, as far as for the home and entertainment, television still looked like furniture, although there were some smaller models that were encased in plastic. But the television was still a mammoth central piece of furniture that sat in the family's living room. The first remote control TVs. You didn't have a channel then to tell you what was on TV. You had to subscribe to a magazine called TV Guide. Up there in the top, during the 1970s, they developed a new medium by which to carry data on a magnetic tape. It was called the 8-track tape. The 8-track tape did exactly that. It carried 8 tracks, 8 songs, an A side and a B side, each side with 4 songs. And you just took that tape and inserted it in an 8-track player and then picked one of 8 songs that you wanted to hear. To my left, lower left, you have the AM/FM transistor radio. I mean, they've been around since the 60s, but they got better since the 70s. There was no Walkman. So music on the go, that was the best you were going to get. And then there was some craze for a little while for CB radio, Citizen Band radio. That everybody was buying these silly Citizen Band radios and talking to each other over the CB. And then, of course, all the way in the upper right-hand corner, you have the granddaddy of video game consoles, although to be honest with you, this doesn't come out till 78, 79, the Atari or the Atari 2600. And the first at-home video game ever designed for the use of the 2600 was Pong, which was basically 2 rectangles and a square, and the square was bouncing between the rectangles. But you have to start somewhere. And if you ever wanted to look like what probably the inside of your dad's car would have looked like in the 1970s, there you go. And right, we even see an 8-track player right there with the 2 knobs. And he had to add that to the car's radio. So it's a very typical gas guzzling, boxing, No attention to aerodynamics whatsoever. Tank of a car of the 1970s. Architecture, postmodern architecture, you have some iconic um, examples of 1970s architecture. We have the starting, well, I don't know to your point of view, the Dark Building first. That's in Chicago. It was called the Sears Tower. Now it's called the Willis Tower. Second largest building in the United States. You said postmodern. You have to say postmodern is form over function over form. Less interest in what the building looks like than what it's supposed to function as, which is provide space for people. Okay? Hence, you basically just get a lot of glass and concrete. The buildings in the middle have a special significance to us now. There was a lot of critics when these buildings were built. The two World Trade Center, the Twin Towers. Um, the idea behind the Twin Towers was kind of revolutionary in architecture. Um, it was concrete was the number one material used in the Twin Towers. Um, the idea of the Twin Towers was an exoskeleton. The weight of the building hung on the exoskeleton, which was the exterior facade of the building. Um, in the long run, was that a good idea or not? I mean, I'm not going to even venture in that direction because even further from being an architect or a structural engineer. It had its critics, but eventually, people warmed up to the Twin Towers. And then in San Francisco, you had the, I think, wow, I forgot the name of the company. That's the Prudential Insurance Building. It looks like we're going to be an hour at this, so let's try to pick up the pace because the good stuff is about to come. And like I said, whether it's movies or music or TV, there was something about New York City. As gritty and grimy and polluted, um, Hollywood, just everything was just drawn to New York City. There was something about it. And New York City had seen better days. New York City was a city that was approaching fiscal bankruptcy. I used to show a documentary in class, which I would not show online. It's called New York 77, and it's based on 1977, that year in New York. So there's some very highly inappropriate parts there that I would normally skip in class, but I can't. So New York City for the 1970s, it becomes the iconic backdrop for that period. Here's a famous picture taken. I No, that's not the Brooklyn Bridge. That could be the Verrazano Bridge, or I don't think that's the Verrazano Bridge. That might be the George Washington Bridge. But I guess that photograph gives a feel for, the gritty, grimy, very dangerous aura that New York City gave off during this period, and it fit the times so well. So we're going to talk about music, okay? Because in that New York City, in that period in American history, under those conditions, great music was going to pop up. New York City might have had a lot of things not going for it, but it was still the cultural epicenter of the United States, if not the world. For example, downtown Manhattan, you had one particular nightclub that was not even designed, it wasn't even intended to be for this particular genre of music, CBGB. And out of CBGB would come a new genre of music. And so what is this coming from? Remember, the late 1960s, you get a lot of acts that are very politically conscious, a lot of protest music, a lot of folk music. Remember, Greenwich Village was home to a lot of the folk scene. And then I guess the war ending the way it did, Nixon's presidency ending the way it did, I don't want to say that hope gave way to cynicism or nihilism, But some would argue that. And this cynic nihilism would find its musical expression in the genre of punk. Punk was born in the United States. Punk was born in the United States. Punk was born in the mid 70s in a club in Lower Manhattan called CBGB's. Out of this club, you're going to get acts that are the founding acts of that musical genre. The Ramones, Blondie, which is not the name of the female lead, it's the name of the group, and Talking Heads. And these are groups that are going to enjoy long-term success. So the New York of the 70s gives us punk music, but it doesn't stop there. For those that were doing a little bit better, okay, the ones that were making money, and well, let's step back because so many musical genres have gone through the same experience. Humble, gritty, hard scrabble roots, only to be co-opted by the record companies, pushed into the mainstream, and ends up being something else. If punk came out of young, disaffected, post-war, white American kids who no longer had anything to believe in, okay. Disco itself, this is the genre. Disco came out of the primarily black and Puerto Rican gay community of New York, who quite often would host parties at home or in the several gay clubs in New York City. Remember, this is after Stonewall, okay? And the music that came out of those clubs, okay, earned a reputation. Hey, this is great music, and more and more people start making their way into these clubs as cultural tourists, if you will. And it's a completely unique sound, and it's the emphasis and the attention is all about dancing and having a good time. Eventually, it goes mainstream. Eventually, it goes out of the gay community in New York, and it becomes something to make money off. And before you know it, you're making movies, and you're selling gold and platinum records. And then it starts becoming something about the well-to-do crowd. The crowd that is well-to-do, that is able to acquire wealth during these very difficult times and flaunt it. Okay, an attitude of hedonism. That's where you get Studio 54 in New York City, which becomes, once it's no longer confined, to the clubs and the gay community, and it's out there in the mainstream, then, Studio 54 picks up on it with its highly exclusive rules, who they let in and let out, and celebrities are seen in Studio 54, and of course drugs and et cetera, et cetera. And then it really goes mainstream when the Bee Gees agreed to write most of the soundtrack for the film that's going to become the introduction of most Americans to disco, Saturday Night Fever, starring John Travolta. And up there we have Donna Summers. Um, and so disco is another musical genre that is born same city, same place, same times, same conditions, but a different direction. Okay? Disco's shelf life is shorter, but it's not, because disco quite quickly evolves into other genres that are still very much alive today. Okay, it splits into a variety of dance-oriented genres, freestyle or electro or techno or what have you, even till now to what you would hear in a typical club today. That's all goes back. So the idea of the disco, of a DJ playing music, that all goes back to the beginnings of disco. Even in Spanish, referring to a club as disco, discoteca, it all goes back to that, its origins. If you want to explore more of New York City's, you know, music scene in the 1970s, we have to leave Manhattan and go north to the borough just north of Manhattan. Really tough place, you know? Things aren't economically doing well. Poverty, guess what poverty breeds? Not the best in human beings. We're going to go to the Bronx, to the South Bronx. All of New York City, but particularly Bronx, had a youth gang problem at this time, which is historical. This goes back to the mid 1800s. Okay. Most of these gangs are going to be black or Puerto Rican. There was a film made in the late 70s called The Warriors that was highly fictionalized, um, but not. There were literally, hundreds of thousands of gang members, hundreds of different gangs throughout New York City. And it was a serious problem, particularly in the most run-down neighborhoods. One of these gangs that was predominantly African American was called the Black Spades. The violence between the gangs had reached a point um, that was more, New York was a cesspool at this time, okay? As far as crime was rampant, crime was everywhere. Everybody could expect to be mugged at least once if you lived in New York City, okay? And you had drug use and you had heroin and you had your bad neighborhoods and your not so bad neighborhoods, but New York was in a really bad state, which is crazy. I mean, wow, then you have all this art and culture coming out of New York. There's a documentary. I don't think any of the channels carry it for free. It's called The Kings of Rubble. It came out recently that it talks about, the problem that New York City was having with gangs in the 1960s. So where are we getting at? If if punk came out of one particular subculture, if disco came out of the gay subculture in New York City, this next musical genre was born out of the gang culture, particularly in the Bronx where it was born. It's the one that it's enjoyed the longest um, success, the greatest commercial success of all of these genres I've just mentioned so far, and has evolved significantly from its beginnings. In the 1970s, hip hop was born. And it was born in New York City. It was born in the Bronx. It was born out of the gang culture that existed in the Bronx. Okay? DJ Kool Herc is considered to be the father of hip hop. In that, okay, to negotiate peace between the various warring gangs, they would hold block parties, whether it was DJ Kool Herc or Grandmaster Flash or Africa Bombada, who used to be a black spade. The idea was let's stop fighting and killing one another, okay? And we could challenge each other other ways, okay? So hip hop is more than just a musical genre. An entire culture came out of it. Graffiti, breakdancing, um, and DJing. The type of how hip hop music came out is cool. Kool Herc is sampling. He's taking bits, particularly drum beats from artists like, for example, a very popular artist to sample from was James Brown. One particular song called "Funky Drummer," and the idea was to find one particular drum beat, okay, and then have it continue between two copies of the same record, and then blend it in with another drum beat that blends in seamlessly from another song. It was all about, beats, and from this is, yeah, you eventually get, it's as crazy it may seem, you get to where we are now. To get to where we are now. And I have one more musical genre to show you, because it's not just three, it's also four. So if you want to like explode, your Cuban family's brains, just tell them, hey, guess what I found out today? Salsa was invented in the United States. What do you mean? Yeah, it was. So let's go back to New York of the 1960s and 70s. Who's the predominant Hispanic, population in New York? Cubans are there. Cuba, they were drawn first and foremost to Miami, but the second largest place of destination for Cubans leaving Cuba was technically Union City, New Jersey, and that whole area of North Bergen, West New York, Hoboken. Um, but compared to other Hispanic groups in New York City, small. The largest Hispanic group in New York City at the time were Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans by far were the majority. Okay. And in the 1950s, there was Spanish. You could still get records, and there was still radio that played music to the Hispanic community in New York, and a lot of it was Cuban. Okay, so you get mambo coming from Cuba, you get song, danzón, etc., etc. And then the Cuban Revolution happens, then the Cuban embargo happens, which is not just about commerce, it's also about culture. It's also about music and art and literature. It's also about culture. And then the Hispanic community of New York was on their own. Where do we take from? Where do we borrow from? It's not coming in the radio and it's not in the records like we use words. And so out of that, out of being forced to develop something from the ground up due to the absence of Cuban music, which was the most popular type of music you would hear in New York's Hispanic community before the 60s, a new genre emerges, which is salsa. Okay, which a lot your grandparents might tell you, yes, it is based rhythmically on the Cuban song. Okay, its origins, its foundation is the Cuban song, but in which they added to and deviated from to great extent. And so it emerged as a dance music that catered for the most part to Hispanics from the Caribbean, but eventually became popular all over the place. Like some of the biggest acts were even Colombian, for crying out loud. And the biggest group that came out in the 1970s, believe it or not, it's kind of dying out now. The 1970s was a golden age for salsa. The greatest legendary acts in that genre of music came out in the 70s. And the epicenter was New York. It was New York. Okay? And they created a salsa supergroup, which members came and members left. Okay? But this group had so many people that eventually would become legendary, not just in this genre, but just in Latin music overall. Johnny Pacheco, Ruben Blades from Panama. He's the guy in the center. Maybe you notice the lady that he's is sitting in the bottom row, right in the middle. Celia Cruz, who was a star in Cuba with La Sonora Matancera. I believe that was the name of her group. She leaves Cuba and she finds her way into Fania All Stars, and from there carves a career of herself of her own. Tito Puente, legendary drummer, and probably the greatest salsa singer ever. Let me see if I can find him in this picture. He's all the way in the upper right hand corner. Not the guy with the guitar on the other side, Hector Lavoe. Okay, which all salsa singers look up to, as this was the father, not the father, but this was the legend. So there you have it. Could you believe, punk, disco, hip hop, and salsa all came out of the same place at the same time. So that's all I could give you guys for domestic history and popular culture of the 1970s. We're going to stop it at 59 minutes. I'm going to give you a quiz. Hopefully you watched this and learned something from it. And the next time we talk, it'll be about the 1980s.